She had been living with her parents' bodies for 4 years, sleeping in the same house, ordering takeout, gambling online with their money. 4 women, 4 families destroyed. But the question that haunts investigators isn't just what they did. It's the complete absence of remorse that followed. No apologies, no tears, no regret. Just silence, and in some cases, a disturbing kind of calm. Bellevue, Idaho, September 2, 2003, Labor Day weekend. Alan and Diane Johnson had no idea that morning would be their last. Their 16-year-old daughter Sarah was dating a 19-year-old man named Bruno Santos, and they'd had enough. The relationship had to end. They weren't just going to forbid it anymore. They were planning to report Bruno to authorities for statutory rape. Sarah attended Wood River High School in Haley. She was their daughter, living under their roof, subject to their rules. But that Labor Day weekend, something shifted. The argument escalated beyond words, beyond threats. Early that morning, Sarah walked to the guest house. She retrieved a .264 caliber rifle. Then she walked back into the main house, carrying it with her. Her mother, Diane, was asleep in her bed. Sarah shot her in the head. Her father, Alan, was in the shower. Defenseless, vulnerable, she shot him twice in the chest. 2 separate locations, 2 deliberate acts. Time passed between each killing. This wasn't a moment of sudden rage. This was calculated. When investigators arrived, they began piecing together what happened. The evidence they found would eventually convict Sarah, but it came with questions that still haven't been answered. DNA evidence turned up inside a latex glove. That became the prosecution's strongest weapon. But here's what doesn't fit. The actual murder weapon. The rifle itself had fingerprints on it. Unidentified fingerprints. Not Sarah's. Nobody ever explained whose prints those were or how they got there. March 16, 2005. Sarah Johnson was convicted. 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 15 years for the firearm enhancement. She was born January 24, 1987, which made her barely 18 when the verdict came down for murder she committed at 16. She's been imprisoned at Pocatello Women's Correctional Center ever since. Multiple appeals have been filed over the years. Her lawyers tried to leverage Supreme Court rulings about juvenile sentencing, arguing that life without parole for crimes committed as a minor violates constitutional protections. Every appeal has been denied. The Idaho Supreme Court upheld her conviction in 2008. The legal system considers this case closed, resolved, finished. But Sarah Johnson has never confessed, not during the trial, not during 2 decades of imprisonment. No apology to her extended family. No acknowledgement of what happened that September morning. She maintains her innocence. Still, after all these years, the courts say she's guilty. The DNA evidence says she's guilty. But remorse, regret, admission? None of it ever came. Memphis, Tennessee, June 2005. Jennifer Jackson was 39 years old, a single mother raising her daughter, Nura, in a city that had already taken too much from their family. 15 months before Jennifer's death, Nura's father had been murdered, one parent gone. When Memphis homicide detectives processed the scene, they found something unusual. A wicker basket had been placed over Jennifer's head. Investigators believed this detail mattered. Sometimes, killers who know their victims can't face what they've done. Covering the face is psychological, not practical. It suggests guilt, horror, and inability to look at the consequences. The investigation turned toward Nura almost immediately. Prosecutors built their case on circumstantial evidence. A cut on Nura's hand that she couldn't fully explain, a late-night trip to Walgreens, behavior that seemed off in the hours after her mother's death. But here's the problem. Despite 50 stab wounds, despite that level of close contact violence, investigators found zero DNA evidence linking Noura to the crime scene. No blood on her clothing, no blood in her car, nothing. When you stab someone 50 times, blood gets everywhere. On the killer's hands, arms, clothes, shoes. Transfer is inevitable. It's physically impossible to avoid. Yet none of Jennifer's blood was found on Noura anywhere. The defense pointed to evidence that prosecutors either ignored or downplayed. Prosecutors made improper comments about Noura's decision to invoke her right to remain silent. That's a constitutional protection. You cannot be punished for refusing to testify against yourself. The moment prosecutors used her silence as evidence of guilt, they violated fundamental legal principles. After spending 11 years in prison, Noura was offered a deal. May 20, 2015, she entered what's called an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter. An Alford plea is a strange legal mechanism. It allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while simultaneously acknowledging that the state has enough evidence to potentially convict them at a new trial. Essentially, Noura said, "I didn't kill my mother, but I understand you have evidence, and I don't want to risk another trial." She was released after serving roughly a decade behind bars. To this day, the Innocence Project is working on her case. They're pursuing updated DNA testing, hoping modern forensic technology can finally identify those two unknown females whose DNA was at the scene, or whose hair Jennifer held as she died. Here's the complexity with Nura Jackson and the question of remorse. She has never confessed to murdering her mother. No admission, no apology, no closure for Jennifer's family and friends. But if she didn't commit the murder, then remorse would be a lie. If she's innocent, why would she apologize for something she didn't do? The case remains technically unsolved. No one else has ever been charged with Jennifer Jackson's death. The legal system released Noura, but it never exonerated her. It never found the real killer, if there was one. So when we ask about remorse, we're really asking a different question. Does the absence of remorse indicate guilt? Or does it simply reflect someone who refuses to confess to a crime they didn't commit, even after losing 11 years of their life? Nobody knows. And Jennifer Jackson's real killer, if it wasn't Noura, is still out there. Great Barrow, Essex, a quiet town in the United Kingdom where retired couples spend their final years in peace. John and Lois McCullough were 70 and 71 years old in June 2019. They had raised their daughter Virginia, watched her grow into adulthood, and now they were simply living out their retirement. Ordinary lives, unremarkable routines. Virginia had other plans. She began crushing prescription medication into her father's alcoholic drinks. Little by little, poisoning him over time. She wanted it to look natural, perhaps. A gradual decline. An elderly man's health failing. But her mother, Lois, wasn't dying fast enough from the poison. So Virginia made a decision. She picked up a hammer and beat her mother with it. Then she stabbed her to death. 2 murders. 2 different methods. Her father poisoned slowly, her mother killed with blunt force and a blade. Then came the truly disturbing part. Virginia didn't run, didn't panic, didn't call anyone or confess or try to stage it as an accident. Instead, she built a tomb for her father inside their home. She used breeze blocks and sleeping bags, constructing a makeshift burial chamber. Her father's body was sealed inside, hidden within the walls of the house he'd lived in for years. Her mother's body? Virginia wrapped it in a sleeping bag and stored it inside a wardrobe. Just placed it there, closed the door, and went about her life. For 4 years, Virginia McCulla lived in that house. She slept in rooms adjacent to her parents' remains. She ordered takeout, watched television, used the internet. She functioned normally while 2 decomposing bodies were mere feet away. But she wasn't just living there. She was spending their money. Virginia had run up debts in her parents' names, a total of £149,697. That's nearly $190,000. Of that amount, she gambled away £21,193 online. More than $26,000 lost to gambling sites, while her parents rotted in their own home. She kept collecting their pensions. She intercepted their mail. When people asked about John and Lois, Virginia had stories ready. They were on holiday. They were too ill to see visitors. They didn't want to be disturbed. Every excuse, every lie, bought her more time. Then, March 2020 arrived. COVID-19 lockdowns began sweeping across the United Kingdom. Suddenly, Virginia's deception became easier. Nobody questioned why elderly parents weren't seeing family or attending gatherings. Social distancing was the law. Isolation was expected. The pandemic provided perfect cover for what she'd done. She canceled their medical appointments. She told their doctor they were shielding, staying safe, couldn't come in. For months, then years, the story held. Nobody pushed back. Nobody demanded proof of life. Until September 2023, Virginia's GP finally raised concerns. Too many canceled appointments. Too many excuses. Something felt wrong. The doctor contacted authorities. Police began investigating. They went to the house in Great Baddow. They spoke with Virginia. And when they arrested her, when they told her they knew what she'd done, Virginia McCulla responded with 7 words that revealed everything about who she was. "Cheer up, at least you've caught the bad guy." Like she was congratulating them on solving a puzzle. July 4, 2024. Virginia pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. No trial needed. She admitted to everything. October 11, 2024. Chelmsford Crown Court sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. She'll be in her 70s before she's even eligible for parole consideration. Given the nature of her crimes and the 4 years of deception that followed, she may never be released. Throughout the investigation, throughout the court proceedings, throughout her sentencing, Virginia never broke down. No emotional collapse, no tears for her parents, no expressions of regret or horror at what she'd done. That arrest quote tells you everything. She wasn't devastated at being caught. She wasn't overwhelmed with guilt finally surfacing. She was almost proud. Proud of successfully hiding 2 murders for 4 years. Moscow, Russia, July 2018. Mikhail Khachaturyan lived in an apartment with his 3 daughters, Kristina, Angelina, and Maria, teenagers and young adults who should have been going to school, seeing friends, building lives. Instead, they were trapped. When police eventually searched that Moscow apartment, they found something that explained everything. Mikhail kept an arsenal: knives, hammers, a crossbow, rifles, 2 air guns, a traumatic weapon, 16 bullets, 16 darts. These weren't sporting goods stored in a closet. This was a collection of instruments used for control, for fear, for terror. The sisters would later describe what their father did to them: years of physical abuse, psychological torture, sexual assault. They lived in that apartment with a man who had turned their home into a prison. July 27, 2018. Mikhail Khachaturyan was found dead. Multiple stab wounds to his chest and neck, cut wounds across his body. The 3 sisters didn't deny what happened. They killed him. They used a knife and pepper spray. They attacked their father together, and they ended his life. But their defense lawyer stood in front of investigators and said something that changed the entire framework of the case. This wasn't murder. This was survival. These girls had no other way out. Russian authorities initially charged them under Article 105.2g of the Russian Criminal Code, premeditated group murder. If convicted, each sister faced up to 20 years in prison. But then something unusual happened, something that almost never occurs in cases like this. March 2021. Russian investigators formally recognized the sisters as victims. They opened a separate criminal case against Mikhail Khachaturyan. The charges? Sexual assault, coercion into sexual acts, torture. The state was simultaneously prosecuting the sisters for murder, while acknowledging that the man they killed had committed horrific crimes against them. April 21, 2025. A Moscow court reached a verdict in the case against their dead father. Mikhail Khachaturyan was posthumously convicted of sexual violence, inflicting serious bodily harm. The court examined the evidence. They reviewed what investigators found, and they concluded that everything the sisters had described was real. The abuse happened, the torture happened, the sexual assault happened. So now the question becomes, if the Russian legal system itself confirmed that Mikhail Khachaturyan brutalized his daughters for years, how do you prosecute those daughters for fighting back? Maria, the youngest sister, was found mentally unsound at the time of the killing. She's been tried separately from her older sisters. She's currently undergoing psychological treatment, receiving help for the trauma she endured. Christina and Angelina have been waiting for their trial since August 2020. Multiple attempts at jury selection have failed. The proceedings keep getting postponed. The case drags on year after year. Meanwhile, the sisters have been allowed to live relatively normal lives while awaiting judgment. They finished school, they got jobs, they rent their own apartments. They're functioning members of society, no longer trapped in that apartment with their father's weapons and his violence. But the murder charges remain. In July 2020, prosecutors upheld those charges despite massive public outcry, despite confirmed evidence of abuse, despite the posthumous conviction of their father. The Khachaturyan case sparked protests across Russia. Moscow, St. Petersburg, cities throughout the country saw demonstrations demanding changes to domestic violence laws. People carried signs supporting the sisters. They chanted for justice. They argued that these young women shouldn't be prosecuted for surviving. Yet the legal system hasn't resolved the contradiction. The sisters are still waiting for trial. The state still considers them accused murderers, and the question of their fate remains open. Here's where remorse becomes complicated in ways the other cases weren't. The Khachaturyan sisters have never expressed remorse for killing their father. They're not sorry he's dead. They've never apologized for taking his life. But should they? When your abuser is posthumously convicted of the exact crimes you described, when the state itself confirms you were telling the truth about years of sexual violence and torture, if someone escapes a burning building, do we demand they feel guilty for breaking a window? If someone fights off an attacker, do we insist they apologize for the injuries they caused? This case breaks the simple narrative we've seen in the others. Sarah Johnson showed no remorse and was convicted based on evidence. Noura Jackson showed no remorse but might be innocent. Virginia McCulla showed no remorse and reveled in what she'd done. But the Khachaturyan sisters show no remorse because they believe, and the Russian courts have partially confirmed, that killing their father was the only way to stop him from destroying them completely. They're not sociopaths, they're survivors, and survival doesn't always come with apologies attached. So here's what I want you to think about. When does absence of remorse indicate someone who's truly dangerous? And when does it simply reflect someone who refuses to apologize for surviving, or for standing by their version of events? Where's the line between a cold-blooded killer and someone who had no choice? Sarah Johnson remains imprisoned at Pocatello Women's Correctional Center. Nura Jackson continues fighting for full exoneration with help from the Innocence Project. Virginia McCulla is serving life with a 36-year minimum. The Khachaturyan sisters are still waiting for their trial, years after killing their father. 4 women, 4 families destroyed, and 4 very different answers to the question of remorse. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because these cases don't have simple answers, and maybe they're not supposed to.